Hello, Barra Kahn. It's good to see you.
Good to see you as well, Tom.
I thought our conversation today might talk about why both of us, separately and together, have been inspired by body-based work for so many years. The work we do now is simply the latest iteration of the work we've been doing for decades. So, both with ourselves and with others, what inspired you at the earliest time to get involved in this world of body-based work?
Sure. Thanks for asking. Yoga has been my oldest relationship, my longest relationship. I started doing yoga when I was 14. I started teaching it when I was 17. There were no yoga certifications way back then, but I have since gotten certified. I got grandfathered into which you need now to teach. And I have been pretty much consistently teaching for more than 50 years. It has always been a source of the obvious physical strength and flexibility and coordination and balance, but also it's been a source of peace for me. It's been a source of grounding and a source of spiritual connection. And oddly enough, when I was 18, my mother signed us both up for a TM training, and we did that together, which was like really delightful. As I look back, I'm not sure I appreciated it, that fact as much then as I do now, that my mother did TM. That was really delightful. I don't know that she stuck with it. I did for many, many years until I switched and let go of that mantra and switched and tried other various forms of meditation. But getting back to the body, for me, the physical was always essential. And without knowing it at that point, I was developing a way of listening to the wisdom of the body. Of course, I don't think I would have defined it that way then, but I sure do now. And I have a deep listening for that. Then I went on to get a master's degree that included psychology, which I never used. And when I found core energetics, it was like the perfect marriage of lifelong yoga and my unused degree in psychology. And I was able to merge those two pieces and stay connected with the body work and bring in the mind as well. So that's, like, in a nutshell, how it developed for me.
For me, my interest in the body as it relates to psychology and spirituality started, I think, with my realization as a teenager that I did not resonate with a spiritual path that had to do a lot with belief or dogma. That I was really drawn toward, particularly in my late teens, really drawn away from dogmatic approaches to religion and spirituality and more toward practice modalities. I think the one I first really resonated with when I was about 19 was Zen Buddhism, which seemed to pay almost no attention whatsoever to belief and a lot of attention to practice. And that really resonated with me. Now, the practice wasn't wildly physical, at least not the version that I encountered when I was that age. Later versions that I encountered of Zen and other forms of Buddhism did involve more of the body. For example, I'd say that my relationship with embodied education evolved when you and I discovered LifeSpring. Back in I discovered it in the late 80s, and then you and I kind of got into it with some depth in the early 90s, and it was very seriously embodied education. And that really landed with me, to learn something through my experience of my own doing of something was novel. I had spent a lot of my first 3.5 decades learning from the neck up, except in the Buddhist practice that I had taken up at 20. So LifeSpring certainly accelerated that, but I think it was probably not until I got to Shalom Mountain and started doing the embodied work that you and I both discovered there in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, that I got into this kind of intense embodied work that relates to psychology and spirituality that ultimately led to my going into core energetics. So that's a kind of a succession there. There's also a stage in there for me that had to do with the version of Tantra that was being taught at Shalom at that time by our mutual friend Viana Bergen. It wasn't the California Tantra, better sex through good breathing version. It was really the more authentic Himalayan Tantra that is hews closer to the texts of Tantra as we find them 1,000 or more years ago.
Yes.
And I would say that was a very important piece of getting my attention to drop from my head down into my body as it related to my own spiritual path and my own psychological healing. So for me, it was a multi-stage process as well. LifeSpring was a big thing for you as well. I know you got deeply involved in that as an embodied process.
I mean, everything was always embodied for me because I always have been an experiential learner, and LifeSpring, I guess, was probably the first place that, in terms of a real educational process where that was really emphasized and accepted and promoted. And so I had a big yes around that. Yeah, and I did actually go work for LifeSpring for not terribly long, but I did actually go. I was the advanced course manager of the programs here in Washington, D.C. area, and I went to Moscow and Latvia to lead some trainings before our younger son was born. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that was actually a very, very good experience in LifeSpring. Ultimately, a step, like the next step before
Right.
core energetics, for
Right.
sure.
I also remember when you first discovered Shalom Mountain back, I think you went in 96 for the first time. You called me on Saturday morning of your first weekend at Shalom Mountain and said, "Oh my God, this is like LifeSpring, except with a much more serious dose of love." And so that interplay between embodied work, breath work, and love, which I think for both of us has also woven into our spiritual lives pretty strongly, was something that I remember very clearly you remarking in your experience, and that certainly was mine as well. So for me, Shalom served as a bridge to our current world of core energetics and other somatic healing modalities. My own path out of the Shalom world into the core energetics world came out of a process in which I was kind of approaching a career choice in my life. I was tired of or I did not see myself going into my 70s as a corporate consultant. And so I started a very deep process. Well, what do I want to do? I'm not much on golf, and we don't have grandchildren yet. And so all the retirement paths of all my law school buddies was not all that attractive to me. And so I took a deep meditative approach to like, what next? And I kept coming back to something like Shalom, but more on a daily basis. What can I do on a daily basis professionally that resembles what goes on at Shalom? And of course, a lot of the leaders at Shalom Mountain are core energetics practitioners. And so it was around that time that I started talking to you about, well, what do you think about my getting into the core world? And you were very encouraging and inspiring in our conversations. I particularly remember a dinner we had in Arlington, which I was kind of at that cusp point about a year before I joined the program at the Institute. That got me quite inspired. In fact, I think you had just come back from China, and we're talking about your meeting with business leaders in China about the embodied work as it relates to that. And of course, that resonated with the industrial organizational psychologist in me.
Yeah, that was a very powerful experience for me to take core energetics to China. It was really eye-opening culturally, and how this is an amazing bridge between cultures, between all cultures, really, when you think about it.
We all have bodies.
we all have bodies, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And we all have minds and we all have spirits. So, yeah, it was very good. The difference for me between Shalom and Core was at Shalom, you go and you do a training weekend and then you go away, maybe for 6 months or a year. Maybe you go back and do another training, but there's not any like consistent work and connection and keep it going. And how do you, like, the door opens and then how do you keep it open? It's like in core energetics, we talk about expansion and contraction, right? And you do a session or a training weekend and there's an expansion that happens, and then you leave and there's a natural contraction. That's natural. It's going to happen. You'll get triggered by something in the external world. And then you go back again, or you go back to your next session and you expand again and you contract maybe a little less. And then you expand a little more and contract a little less and expand a little more and contract a little less until the expansion is where you live and the contraction happens when you get triggered. But then you have tools
Right.
to notice first. Of course, you can't do anything until you're conscious of what's happening. And then when the consciousness opens, you go, oh, I don't have to stay here. I can go back into that expanded state. And so you've got these tools then that take you back. And so you can really live in a more expanded state, which is infinitely better.
Yeah, I think that's a struggle that retreat centers have generally.
Yeah.
Shalom is no exception, that they have this one-off experience. And even if you do, as one of my friends did for years, go once a month, there are still those 3 weekends and all those weeks in between the sessions.
Yeah.
And that's an exception. Most of the folks I know, and including myself, even at first, don't go to these retreats on a regular basis. It wasn't until I kind of lived across the street from that
Yeah.
retreat center that I was able to go with that level of frequency.
Yeah. So it's a different model, and
Right.
which is fine. It's for a different kind of person who
Yeah.
doesn't want to make a commitment for ongoing work. And so there are those people, and that's fine.
Well, and I wouldn't even say that it's necessarily some people over here and some people over there. I would say that perhaps the ideal relationship between these retreats and a regular relationship with a practitioner is that the retreats might open up a particular awareness that then can be explored. I continue to lead retreats here in North Carolina, little one-day versions of the Shalom retreat, but also some other retreats and workshops that open up the participants to a particular possibility within themselves. And then quite often, these are already existing clients, or they're folks who become clients out of their own commitment to lifelong learning. This is not a fix for a brokenness. This is just a part of the education of being a human being, as it seems to me. And I think that's a fundamental difference.
And the beauty of the core energetics model is that you cannot outgrow the work. You cannot outgrow the work. So you can do this work as long as you're alive.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's appealing to me about the core energetics approach, is that it's not rooted in the notion that we are fixing a problem
Right.
or a broken person. There is no broken person.
Right.
What core energetics is an ongoing educational process that involves a partnership between the client and the practitioner. And that's one of the big differences between, I think, this kind of practice and this kind of relationship and the retreat model.
Yeah.
I saw an interesting interview with Gabor Mate about brokenness. And he cited in this interview a Leonard Cohen song in which Leonard speaks about the wholeness below healing the brokenness above. I think the song is called Come Healing. And it's a really gorgeous perspective that I think is reflected in the core energetics world. And that is that at our core, we're perfect and whole, not broken at all. And then at the surface of our being, we might experience something that feels like brokenness, but that if we return our attention and our energy to the core of each of us, then that then kind of propels us into a healing of any perceived brokenness we might have.
And so, thus, the model of mask, lower self, higher self, and the pathway is to uncover the mask and to release the lower self, which covers the higher self. So if we live in this fixed expression, we have this fixed expression, all of us on our face, and we all have a mask. But once we take off the mask and move the lower self energy out of the way, that binds us and that keeps us away from our core or our higher self. Once we move that lower self energy, we get grounded, we get clarity, we drop into our bodies, and we access our higher self. And do we stay there? No, but that's the process of expansion contraction. We access our higher self, but then the external world will trigger us to give us new lessons. So we're developing constantly learning. And we think, wait a minute, universe, I already learned this lesson when we get it again. And the universe goes, yeah, I see that you think you learned that lesson, but we really want you to get it this time. Really, really, really want you to get it. So we're going to give it to you again.
And, you know, it may be that we learned the lesson the first time, but there's a whole new set of circumstances that require us to learn something else about the lesson that we didn't weren't challenged to learn the first time around because
another color, another shade of this lesson. Yeah. For me, it's a really good model that involves working with images from the past and using those images and accessing the natural vibration in the body to open up the energy blocks. They can be anywhere in the body, and to access them and open up the energy blocks starts to very slowly release parts of our history. Interesting. I just had a session with somebody who I've been working with for maybe a little more than 6 months. And we noticed after he moved some big energy, and he went into a position that we call the bow, which is a discharge position to download everything that he got. Holding that position, his body is now vibrating in a way that he did not have access to even 2 months ago, even last month. And the deeper vibration, and he could feel this, that the deeper vibration was opening up new awareness, like new insights came as he stood there in the bow, and the real ahas that he would not have accessed if we were just doing this, if we were just talking. There's not a chance he would have accessed that. In that moment anyway. I mean, maybe eventually, but it would take a really long time. And so opening up the energy blocks, accessing the vibration in the body brings a clarity and a wisdom that we cannot get just by talking.
Fascinated by this relationship between vibration and revelation that you just pointed to. Mm-hmm. Our mutual friend, the late Jerry Judd, discovered about a half a century ago for himself that, as he put it, vibration is everything. Mm-hmm. And so he spent the last half of his 100-year-long life consciously for 60 to 90 minutes every single day, vibrating the various parts of his body in an effort to, as he put it, get his chakras spinning and then connect them to each other. Mm-hmm. But what I've noticed is that with a freely vibrating instrument of the body, all sorts of wisdom is allowed to come forth. Mm-hmm. Wisdom that I presume is already in there, but simply needing to be released. It sounds like you have that experience as well with your clients.
Yes, and it really goes all the way back to Einstein, who said that everything is energy. Everything is energy, and the energy is external and it's also internal. And the energy is creating the internal vibration that's really there all the time, but we lock it down. You know, it's like when you go to the gym, or I was a professional dancer for many years, and we would muscle up and pull up and stop the vibration because vibration meant in that world, or means in that world, weakness, and weakness is vulnerability. And there's no place for that in the dance world or in the gym, right? In the pumping way. But when I teach a yoga class, I encourage people, or when I do my sessions, to embrace the vibration, to invite the vibration in, to amplify it, magnify it, so that because the bigger it gets, yes, the more vulnerable your body and psyche become. And then, of course, as that happens, more opening and more insight and more wisdom and more freedom.
Right. And I think this traces back, this whole process traces back to a word you mentioned earlier that it might be worth fleshing out a bit, and that was images. The images are not just visual images. They are actually impressions locked in our bodies, caused typically by some either capital T or small t trauma, very often from the first 6 or 7 years of our lives. And my understanding of it comes out of the old Hindu and Tantric notion of vikalpas, that when at any age, but this happens more often when we're very young, we encounter something that is too much for us to process emotionally or cognitively. We defend ourselves with ideas and even with muscular holding that is a good idea at the time, because it helps us to cope with that trauma, but over time becomes a less good idea and starts to color in negative ways how we see the world, how we respond to the world, and reduces our natural fluidity and our natural tendency to vibrate. And so I would love to hear your notion about the relationship between images, the identification of images, and the freeing up of the energy that's locked in those.
Yeah, the images that we work with may not only be protective, but we actually expand them. Like perhaps there was a trauma, again, little t trauma, big T trauma, but perhaps there was a trauma, and then we expand that story. We build upon that story and we make it, maybe we develop it and make it more than it is. And then we draw conclusions based on that. So if this happened, then this must be true, right? If this is my worldview, if I believe whatever the worldview is, then this must be true. And that's how I have to live my life. So letting go of these images, or opening the doorway to starting to let them go, is really important, because it so impacts our belief system, and our belief system directs our life and the trajectory of our life, and whether we're going to be successful in all areas of our lives, personally, professionally, and with the limitations that we put on ourselves based on those images. So understanding what those images are and how to unlock them and how to release them, because they do help us form our belief system about the world, but also about ourselves in the world, who we are and what we're capable of. And not only our belief system, but more importantly, our limiting belief system.
Right.
So
And it's a little bit like, again, I'll call Jerry Judd to mind, what he used to call gogology. It's almost as if it gives us a pair of goggles through which we see the world, which constrains our vision of what possibilities are out there, constrains our notion of who we're even talking to or who we're looking at in the mirror, as you pointed out. So the art of gogology, as Jerry would put it, is the art of noticing that in the first place, oh, I'm actually wearing goggles, and then looking at them and saying, oh, this is not serving me. But it's not a purely cognitive process, right? It's very seldom a purely cognitive process. Otherwise, we probably would have figured it out earlier.
Right.
But it's actually a process of discovering our goggles in our bodies as our bodies, and then working with our practitioner or on our own to change the vibration so that we can then see different possibilities and see actually a different world.
Yeah, it's a little bit not unlike IFS in that way, and knowing the different parts that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Dick Schwartz has a really beautiful way of the IFS is quite similar to core energetics. We just use different terminology, but the objectives are the same. And core is more active, so we're physically more active, and IFS is a little internal family systems is more designed to work with breath and to look at the images that we have, although he calls them burdens. But like there are many different somatic worlds, somatic modalities that have the same objectives. Personally, I have found home, maybe because I've been so physically oriented all my life. I have found home in the world of core energetics. It seems to me to be the most powerful and effective tool for creating change.
For me as well, and internal family systems, or IFS, is one subset of a broader category of modalities, more broadly known as parts theory or parts modalities. Genpo Roshi's Big Mind is very similar. The Howland Sidris method of psychotherapeutic inquiry also was another modality. All of them involve the use of the imagination to invite the client into imagining themselves as embodying, again, back to the body, embodying a part within the whole being. And like you, I'm drawn to the more energetic and body-centered approach of core energetics because it doesn't merely rely on imagination. Some people have greater access to imagination than others. And so I have found over the years of leading parts theory processes, which I find very powerful and still use with my clients, I still have found more people have access to moving their bodies than they do necessarily to the kind of imagination that IFS and Big Mind and other modalities offer.
Yeah, and core actually offers, I mean, the beauty of core for me is that as more and more people graduate from the training and from the institute, people have, it's a very creative process. So you're going to bring you to your core work. I'm going to bring me, and we're different. And so my work is very body based. One of my colleagues is a professional musician and uses music extensively in his work with his clients. Another one is very breathwork oriented and uses a ton of breath work in his process. And so the model stays the same, but it's very flexible. It's a very flexible system. So
Right.
people can get trained in this work and the more they bring themselves to the work, the more the practitioners learn about themselves, and the more effective they are with their clients by bringing their own flavor, let's say, their own color to the work.
Exactly, because none of us, even the younger folks that I've known doing this work, comes in with zero background. So I have a classmate at the Institute who has been an actor and a teacher of acting. And so I'm sure that influences how he works with his clients.
Yeah.
I'm a psychologist with a deep background in integral theory. And so I actually call myself an integral psychologist for whom core energetics is one modality that I draw on, while drawing on a whole host of other modalities. I mean, I taught mindfulness practices at NIH, as you know, for several years with Dr. Rezvan Ameli, and a whole host of other approaches and techniques that are not limited to the narrow, although deep world of core energetics. And I think that's one of the beauties of the somatic work, is that it invites us to bring our whole self and invites our clients to bring their whole selves. I think that was one of the things in the early readings I did about core energetics that really drew me in, was the unitary theory of the human being. And I think that was in the bioenergetics book that I read in my first year of training, that we are one. We are one thing, and there is no mind-body problem in the world of somatic energy, unlike Philosophy 101, which I took back in the mid-70s. There is no mind-body problem because we are simply one.
Ellen Zanger, I don't know if you know who she is. She's a professor at Harvard. That's exactly what she says, is that there's no mind-body problem. There is one thing. It's not mind-body. There's no split. I mean, core energetics theory says that we do have a split. You know, we create a split. I don't know if there is a split, but we definitely create a split between the mind and the body. And like yourself, so many people, particularly here in the Washington, D.C. area, because we have the largest concentration of PhD graduates here in the country. It's got some very, very smart people, some not so smart people too. But so many people spend how many years of their life in an education system that really focuses from here up, and like that's 10% of me, right? And the other 90% is ignored. Well, maybe, you know, if you go into athletics, it's developed through athletics, but there's no focus on integration. And so we create a separation, but really and truly, it is one thing. And so part of what we do in core energetics is to heal the splits in the body. So the split that we create between the seat of the intellect and the seat of the emotion, between the right side and the left side, between the heart and the pelvis, we have splits throughout the body that do need some attention.
Absolutely. And yet I think it's important to note that these splits hide an underlying unity. And so what we're actually doing is removing artificial barriers to the realization of who we actually are, which is each of us a unitary and whole being. Again, it's the back to Leonard Cohen. It's the surface appearance of brokenness and fragmentation, and the underlying truth is that I am a whole being, learning how to live in alignment with my wholeness, and that the reality is whole, and the illusion is fragmentation.
And that occurs as part of our defense mechanisms, our protections that we develop as, like you said, before the age of 7, most likely. So if I got my heart broken when I was 4 years old, there's an unconscious way in which the body is going to protect itself. That tender little heart is going to be protected and surrounded by, and that keeps developing energetically and muscularly around the heart, and to keep the pain out.
Exactly.
And so as adults, we have to then go back and look at it and say, oh, I'm not that 4-year-old anymore, and I no longer need those protections, but they're so deeply embedded. So it takes consistent patience, kindness, love, self-love to heal that split.
Which takes us back to why an ongoing relationship with a practitioner is important, and in the long run, no doubt more valuable than a couple of weekend experiences at a retreat center, even as valuable as those might be. So
I think of those as door openers.
Exactly. Barra, this has been a great start. Thanks so much for this time.
You're welcome.
And
nice to connect in this way.
Yeah, I look forward to our next conversation.
Great.
All right. Thanks a bunch.
Thanks,
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.